Usually the way we do this is I switch off all your microphones and cameras and so on and so forth. Not because I'm trying to be nasty, but just because it's easier to operate that way. If you have any questions, please write them into the chat box, and I'll try and answer them as we go along. Sometimes I answer questions at the end if they're more complicated questions, but if it's on something that you didn't understand that I just said, then please write it in the chat box and I will respond. All of those who have seen fit, and thank you very much for doing so, to help sponsor these classes. It's much appreciated. I know I didn't respond to all of you and thank you personally, but take this as a personal thank you. And if anyone's interested in helping further, please let me know. Okay, we are now going to begin Sefer Yetzira, chapter 1, the first Mishnah. Chapter 1, the first Mishnah. The writings of Sefer Yetzira, just like the writings of the Mishnah, the rabbinic Mishnahs. What's the Mishnah? The Mishnah is an authentic and authoritative rabbinic writing, and usually the Mishnah is the core of the Jewish law on a particular subject. So it's divided into various tractates, etc., etc. And as I explained last time, the entire oral, that's called the oral Torah as opposed to the written Torah. The written Torah is the 5 books of Moses and the prophets, and the other writings, including Psalms and Song of Songs and all those other things, Tehillim, Shir Hashirim, Ruth, Esther, all those works. But besides the written Torah, which is the 24 books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, they are the rabbinic teachings. And as I mentioned last time, Rabbi Akiva is the famous Rabbi Akiva was the source of all the oral teachings. And it is said, according to tradition, that he was the one that wrote down the Sefer Yetzira, even though it was received all the way back from Abraham, as were many of the teachings were passed on, at least from the time of that the Torah was given on Mount Sinai in the year 2448 in the Hebrew calendar, 2448, which is, if we're now in 5781, so you can figure out how long ago that was, over 3,000 years or 3,500 years ago. So in any event, 2448 was when it was given, and the oral Torah was handed down until about the time of the destruction of the temple, destruction of the second temple, which was the 1st, 2nd century. That era is when things came to be written down in Mishnaic form. And even later on, during the Babylonian exile, they wrote down the Talmud, which is an extension of the Mishnah. It's an explanation of and definitions of what is stated in the oral teachings of the Mishnah. In any event, the very cryptic paragraphs in Sefer Yetzira are also called Mishnahs, just like the other rabbinic teachings. And as I said, they are cryptic. They need to be unpacked. I was hoping to do more or less one Mishnah per class, but I'm not sure that we're going to get there, certainly not in the first few Mishnahs, because they are very dense and need a lot of unpacking. Having said that, let's waste no more time and just read it inside now. I have sent a text to most of you. For those of you who do not have a text, I will share a screen, but if you want the text, I can send it to you. Shirley very kindly shared it with me as a PDF, and so I passed it on to anybody else who would like it, and here we are. This is the Aryeh Kaplan translation, probably the best translation that there is, and his commentary is also excellent in general. His commentary is based mostly on the commentaries of the classic commentators on Sefer Yetzira, including the Raavad and Sagi Nahor and various others. There's many commentaries, including the Arizal and so on, and the Ramak, but Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. But he makes a sort of a compilation of all of them, and it's well worth reading his commentary. I'm going to highlight different sections than he does. He sort of approaches things in a more general sense. I want to get more deeply into the basic important teachings over here, as highlighted by the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and his disciples through the generations in the mystical approach called Hasidism, or Hasidism if you prefer. But that's the approach that I'm going to use mostly. And it's based on a book which I'm writing. I've only finished 2 chapters, but on Sefer Yetzira1, which is a commentary. So I'm going to base it on that, but it's all in Hebrew. So it's not going to help many of you who only speak English. But in any event, here we go. This is Sefer Yetzira1 1, as you can see. I'm going to just read the Hebrew and comment slightly on the Hebrew. I just want to point out that there are various versions of the Sefer Yetzirah. There's a long version, there's a short version, etc. This seems to be the version that is the most, the one Aryeh Kaplan has is the version that was accepted by the Arizal and by the Gaon of Vilna, and this seems to be the most authoritative version over here, this one over here, as you can see. And I'm going to read it in Hebrew, and then and we'll read it again in English, and then I will start to explain. Okay, so the first Mishnah says as far as B'shloshim u'shtayim nitivot, with 32 paths, 32 mystical paths, pliyot chokhmah, of supernal wisdom. Pliyot chokhmah, the word pliyot actually is related in Hebrew to the word pele, which means miraculous wisdom. In other words, wisdom that is on such a high level of wisdom that it doesn't really have a clear explanation. It's wondrous wisdom. It's amazing wisdom, whatever. Anyway, the 32 paths of wisdom, and I'll explain a little bit about this soon. Chakak, he engraved. Who engraved? Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it. The name that follows, or the names that follow, are all the names of God. And it's understood by some that he was the one that engraved. In other words, these names over here are the names that by which he's called, and he was the one that engraved them. Others explain that the word chakak refers to the ultimate infinite one, beyond all names, because even a divine name is a limitation in some sense or another. And what was it that he engraved? He engraved the various names by which he can be addressed in prayer and in scripture. So in any event, chakak means he engraved them. We're going to explain this concept of engraving at length later on. The concept of engraving, however, just note that it's not exactly the same thing as writing. Writing is when you take 2 different materials. You take ink on parchment or ink on paper, and they're 2 different materials that become one thing. But if it's parchment on paper, it can always be, if it's ink on parchment, it can always be scratched off, and the letters can be cracked and no longer be relevant, and so on, no longer be valid. But if something is engraved into stone, there's nothing added. The engraving is in the thing itself, which is a very important idea and relates in its deepest sense to the highest level of the Sefirot. The Sefirot are the divine emanations, which we'll speak about as well. And these divine emanations in the deepest level are called the Eser Sefirot Hagnuzot, the 10 concealed Sefirot. These are the Sefirot that are engraved, so to speak, in the Or Ein Sof, in the infinite light. The infinite light is not God himself, but his revelation of himself, essentially his revelation of himself to himself. All of these concepts will become clear, I hope, later on. Stop me if there's something that you need to understand. I'm not actually seeing, I suppose because I'm sharing now. Let me just see if I can get the chat up here, just in case. Yeah, there's a question in the chat. I see. Here we go. Okay. Okay, Laurie, if you could send me an email so that I'll know which email to send it to. Laurie's asking to send me a copy. Okay. May we take this knowledge into our areas of darkness to bring about light. I certainly hope you will. I certainly hope you will. Yes, good. Okay, so engraved, as we just said. And then come various names, various divine names. Now, I'm not going to read them the way they are written because we are not supposed to just say the names unless one is in the middle of prayer. But anyway, these various names over here, which I'll go through somewhat later on, each of the names here is involved with one of the sfirot, or perhaps in some cases a cluster of sfirot. But in any event, all of these names, and then we call him Rahum here, this word here, meaning the compassionate one. Yeah, the compassionate one, Hanun, the one who shows grace, Ram Venisa, lofty and lifted above all creation, above all other being. Shochen Ad, who dwells forever. The Kadosh Shmo, and holy is his name, Marum Kadosh. Sanctified or elevated and holy, who he is, ubara et olamo, and he created his world b'shlosha sfarim, with 3 sfarim, 3 books. Now this here is open to various interpretations. The first interpretation, which is the way Aryeh Kaplan translates it here, is he says b'sefer v'sfor v'sipur. The sefer was a book, Svar is number, and Sipur is a story. Now, I'm going to explain it differently when we get there, because the Hasidic interpretation, the interpretation that comes from the Baal Shem Tov, is you shouldn't read this as Sefer, you should read it as Sofer. Right? Sofer is the writer, the author. There are 3 books. One of the books, so to speak, is the author of the book, because when the author writes his book, he gives you himself. That is a teaching of our sages as regards the Torah in general. The first word of the 10 commandments, the first word of the 10 commandments is the word Anochi. Aleph, Nun, Chaf, Yud, Anochi. And our sages tell us that the word Anochi is called a notarikon. It spells out a sentence. In other words, each letter of the word Anochi stands for a word. Each letter stands for a word. So Aleph is Ana, which means I, or Ani. Ana, Nafshi, myself. Ktavit, in writing. Yehavit, I gave myself in writing. In other words, when I gave you the Torah, when I gave you the 10 commandments, and then subsequently the Torah, I gave you myself in written form. I gave you myself in the Torah. God, so to speak, hid himself in scripture, in the Torah, in the writings, in the 5 books of Moses. So we say, therefore, that the first word over here, is, we read as Sofer, the author who is in his book. B'sefer, B'sefer, and that is the book, the author of the book, and Sipur is the story. So there's 3 aspects of the book, and we'll come into this. I'll talk about it a lot later on when I get to the actual explanation. Now we're just doing sort of the translation. So the Sefer, and Sipur, with the author, the book, and the story. Others translate it as, again, book and number or border. The word sfor can also mean a border, a boundary. It can also mean a glyph, or like from the word hieroglyphics, a glyph meaning a mark that indicates some concept. And Sipur is the story. Okay, so if you have a look in English, 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved, and then it goes through the various names: merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in eternity, whose name is holy, lofty and holy. He created his universe with 3 books, 3 Sfarim. And he says again, Sefer, Safar, and Sipur. That's how he understands it. As I said, I'm going to explain it somewhat differently. Okay, let us begin now with some of the explanation. And I just wanted to point out that the first chapter that we're studying now, this first chapter is all about the 32 paths of wisdom and what they mean, the 32 paths of wisdom, and the holy names that have been engraved and by which he created the worlds, the various worlds, and we'll talk about that too, and the Sfirot, and their number, their quality, what they're all about, where they come from, and so on and so forth, upper and lower, and so on. Those are the basic subjects, essentially, of the first chapter. Okay, so now we're going to get into. Let me just see in my notes here. 1 second. Yes. Okay. So let me explain what these 32 paths of wisdom. If you have a look in your, Aryeh Kaplan work, you'll see he's got an appendix on page 297, where he explains that these 32 paths of wisdom are 32 different aspects or levels of consciousness. There are 32 aspects or levels of consciousness, and it's worth looking into his explanation over there on page 297, and I think you'll get a lot out of them. Now, just to be aware that in Western psychiatry, you basically only have 3 levels of consciousness, one of which is basically unconscious. But you have, well, maybe 4, yeah, I suppose you could say 4. You have conscious, you have subconscious, and you have unconscious, right? Conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. There are those who also say, there's someone with a more mystical bent, like Carl Jung, talks about the superconscious, but that's not something that's really spoken about in common psychiatry and psychological parlance. They don't talk about the superconscious too much. It's too much of a sort of mystical religious concept for them, so they don't talk about it very much. But the Aryeh Kaplan mentions, and he explains briefly, the 32 levels of consciousness, 32 aspects of consciousness. So I'm not going to go into it here. He does a very nice job over there. You have a look on page 297 of the PDF I sent you, and you will see it there. What I'm going to explain is as follows. When it says that there's 32 paths of mystical paths of wisdom, or paths of mystical wisdom, or paths of wondrous wisdom, depending on how you want to translate it, we have to understand this a little bit better, because essentially there are 2 sets of 32 paths. The first set of 32 paths is the 32 paths of creation, the 32 paths of creation. What are these paths of creation? Well, if you have a look in Genesis, you'll see that the name Elohim is mentioned 32 times. So certain Hasidic commentaries and Kabbalistic commentaries explain that these 32 times that the name Elohim is mentioned, which spells the word Lev, 32. The word 32 in Hebrew is Lamed Bet, right? Because each letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value as well. Lamed is 30 and Bet is 2, so 32. Lamed and Bet are the 32 paths of wisdom. And these are the 32 times that the name of God is mentioned, the name Elohim is mentioned in the process of creation. So there's 32 paths of creation, of creative consciousness or creative flow, you could say. In other words, there's a 32 channels of creative flow of creative juice flowing down into the creation and creating the various things which are created thereby. If you want to see what these are, you look in Genesis in the first and second chapter, and you will see every time the name Elohim is mentioned, these are the 32 paths. Now, interestingly enough, 32 in Hebrew, which spells the word lev, which means heart. These are 32 paths with heart, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But interestingly enough, these 32 paths are the first and the last letter of the Torah itself. The first letter of the Torah is a bet, and the last letter of the Torah is a lamed. La'enei kol Yisrael, Israel, the last letter of Israel, the word Israel is a lamed. So lamed bet incorporates, therefore, the entire Torah. But one aspect of the 32 paths is the Torah of creation. Then there's another 32 paths, which is the 32 paths of supernal wisdom. That's the 32 paths of what might be called searching for God, essentially. So there's 32 paths of divine creativity, and then there's 32 paths of divine searching. Or if you want to put it in a slightly different context, divine wisdom, in other words, how to attain. There's 32 paths of attaining divine wisdom. So this is what there's a verse in Mishnah. Mishnah is Proverbs. In Proverbs 1:20, Proverbs 1, chapter 1, verse 20, Proverbs says as follows: Chochmot bachutz tarona. Chochma, wisdom in the plural, wisdoms, sing to the outside. They sing, or in other words, they sing out to the outside, or they flow to the outside. But notice that the word is in the plural, chochmot, right? Chochmot, in other words, two types of wisdom. Again, the lower wisdom, which is the wisdom of creation, and the higher wisdom, which is the concept of divine wisdom, of reaching, so to speak, the concept of reaching towards the concept of divinity. They're called in Hebrew chokhmah ila'ah, the higher chokhmah, the higher wisdom, and chokhmah tata'ah, the lower wisdom. Higher wisdom, again, would be the wisdom of the Torah, the inner dimension of the Torah in particular, and the 32 paths of wisdom of the lower wisdom are the 32 paths of creation. Okay, so each of them again have 32 paths, and therefore it says the two expressions. If you remember the let me just see if I can share again. Just let me go back to the document of Sefer Yetzira, where it says over there, it says over here, it says the word chakak, he engraved, and it also says the word bara. There's a word chakak and the word bara. Chakak means to engrave, and bara means to create. To create was the 32 paths of wisdom that come out in the process of creation, that are delineated and drawn down in the process of creation. Whereas chakak refers to the 32 paths of wisdom that are engraved into the wisdom of the Torah itself. So therefore you have two words which are used, chakak and bara. The way he says it like this is engraved and created. Engraved and created. You see the word created here, and then the word engraved up here. Right? Those are the two words. Okay, very good. Let us now go back to stop sharing. Okay, there we go. All right, let's continue. What is chokhmah ila'ah? What is the higher chokhmah? This is called the chokhmah that is not known naturally to man. It's not something that is known naturally to man. It is not the chokhmah that you find in the manifested worlds. It's only the chokhmah you find in the hidden worlds. There are 4 levels of immanent divine manifestation, called in Hebrew 4 planes of reality, or 4 worlds, olamot, starting from the bottom: the world of Asiya, the world of action; the world of Yetzira, formation; the world of Bria, creation; the world of Atzilut, the world of closeness, the world of divine manifestation. And then beyond that, there's the world of Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is a much, much higher transcendent type of world. It's not an immanent world, it's a transcendent world. And in Adam Kadmon itself, you have various levels. You have the level of Nikudim, the level of Akudim, you have the level of Brudim. Let me start from the top. Akudim, Nikudim, and Brudim. 3 different levels in the world of Adam Kadmon itself. And that's all prior to the beginning of creation, which was called the Tzimtzum, the divine contraction, which brought about creation. Prior to that, there's the Or Ein Sof. And in the Or Ein Sof itself, you also have 3 levels in the Or Ein Sof. What's the Or Ein Sof? The infinite light. The infinite light means the infinite revelation. It is sometimes used loosely as synonymous with God, but it's not. It's God's revelation, essentially God's revelation of himself to himself, as we mentioned before. And in that there are three revelations: God's revelation of himself to himself, God's revelation of himself as a preparation for revealing himself to himself as the creator. And those are the 3 levels: himself to himself, himself as preparation, and himself as creator. But they're all within the Or Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum even starts. Would that be above space, time, and motion? Absolutely, it would be above space, time, and motion. Space is itself a created entity, and only on the very lower levels of creation, as is time and motion. All of them are in the lower. We'll get to those later on. Actually, in the 2nd chapter, he starts to speak about space, time, and consciousness, or space, time, and soul, olam, shana, nefesh, and what those are all about. We'll discuss that when we get there. Okay, so there's the upper and lower paths. The upper paths are the paths of wisdom in the Torah itself, and especially in the mystical explanation of the Torah. Those are paths of essentially divine consciousness, 32 paths of divine consciousness, called the 32 paths of Chokhmah, of divine consciousness, beyond the creation of the world. In other words, these are mystical levels of consciousness. 32 of them. And then there's the lower 32, which are the 32 paths of creative energy that come into the creation in the world. What are these paths of energy? These are essentially the paths between the Sfirot, which are designated by the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Those are the paths called the Tzinorot, the paths, or the a tzinor is a pipe, the pipelines between the Sfirot, so to speak, pipelines of energy between the Sfirot, designated by the Hebrew letters, and the Sfirot themselves, which are like reservoirs, right? The Sfirot are like reservoirs, and the pipes between them, like channels between the Sfirot. So altogether, there's 32. There's the 10 reservoirs and the 32 and the 22 channels designated by the Hebrew letters. 10 Sfirot and the 22 letters, making the 32 paths of creation. And you have a similar thing in the 32 paths of wisdom in the Torah itself. Okay, let me explain that a little bit better. The sages explain that the Torah is essentially divine wisdom. Right? The Torah is essentially divine wisdom. It says in the Zohar, Oraita michochma nafkat. The Torah emerged from divine wisdom. Not to say it's separated from divine wisdom, it emerged containing divine wisdom. It emerged from the divine wisdom containing divine wisdom, engraved into it. Meaning to say that through these 32 pathways that there are in the Torah, so too the wisdom that is engraved into the Torah is drawn down, or gives us a path to ascend up to divine wisdom. It's drawn down to us, to our understanding, as paths by which we can ascend to a higher level of consciousness, to a higher level of understanding, a higher level of divine awareness. So that's the 32 paths of the supernal divine wisdom. And these are about, as it says, these are the paths that even an eagle does not know. Yeah, there's a verse that says like this, a verse in Job that says, Nativ lo yada'o ayit, the path that the ayit could be a vulture or some kind of very high flying bird, an eagle does not see. It's a path that even an eagle-eyed eagle will not be able to see. Is the higher chokhmah hidden? Yes, it is. The higher chokhmah is hidden, but even though it's hidden, there are paths to it. But these paths are not, the paths have to be sought after. They're not just sort of lying around like a Lego set. We have to uncover them, let's put it that way. Okay. And then there's again the 32 paths of creation, the 32 paths by which the world was created, the creative channels by which divine energy flows into the process of creation. And that is designated by the names, the 32 names of Elohim, as I mentioned, in that we find in the first chapter of Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis. Okay. Now, there are those that designate these two different paths as what is called Da'at Elyon and Da'at Tachton. Da'at Elyon is divine knowledge, and Da'at Tachton is knowledge as it descends into the world. It becomes knowable knowledge through creation. In other words, we can get to a certain level of divinity through understanding creation, through the process of understanding creation. There's a higher level of divinity that we get through the Torah. And the 32 paths are also states of consciousness, as one ascends. Yes, they are. Then Ben asked this question, 32 paths are also states of consciousness as one ascends. Yes. And you'll see that when you look into Rabbi Kaplan's translation of the 32 paths as levels of consciousness, you'll see it there, page 297, I think it was. Okay, so these are called again Da'at Elyon and Da'at Tachton. Da'at Elyon, the higher knowledge, the higher path, the 32 paths of divine wisdom, and then the 32 paths of creation in the process of creation. Now, the entire process of creation, the lower wisdom, follows the higher wisdom. In other words, it was the higher wisdom that implemented the lower wisdom. The lower wisdom is there, the creation of the world essentially is there only for the higher wisdom to be implemented and revealed within the lower wisdom. In other words, within creation. As the Zohar says, the Zohar explains, the Zohar in volume 1 explains as follows, that Chokhmah Ila'ah, the higher wisdom, is drawn down into the lower wisdom by the proper thought processes. When we study in the proper way, it brings the higher wisdom into the lower wisdom. In other words, it brings divine knowledge, divine awareness, divine consciousness into the physical world in which we live, which is what we want. Now, the Zohar explains it as follows. The Zohar says there were 10 commandments, as we know, and there were also 10 utterances through which the world was created. Now, there's a verse which is talking about the dedication of the tabernacle in a section called Parshat Naso. It's in Bamidbar, or in Numbers, chapter 7, verse 86. Chapter 7, verse 86, which talks about the gifts that the princes brought. The various princes of each of the tribes had a prince, So there are 12 princes, and they brought, or Nasi, and Nasi is not really a prince, a leader of a tribe, call him a prince, it's fine, who brought, each of them brought their gifts to the temple, and they brought certain gifts, and it says about one of the gifts like this, that it says, the asara hakaf, they each weighed 10 talents of silver. There was a certain weight. Asara hakaf, right? There was incense that they brought, and they each weighed 10 talents of silver. But it says asara hakaf, 10, the spoon of which was used for the incense. So 10. These 10, says the Zohar, correspond to the 10 commandments and to the 10 utterances through which the world was created, and God said there shall be light, and so on and so forth, those 10 utterances. And they are weighed one against the other. In other words, when I say they're weighed, they're in balance. When the Torah is taken away from the world, in other words, when the scale, the side of the scale that represents the 10 utterances through which the world was created is over heavy, in other words, too much of an emphasis on the world, so that the divine utterances, the 10 commandments, are out of touch. They're not in balance with the world. They're much higher than the world. When they're too high for the world, then the world is out of balance. The point is to get them into a balance, not to destroy the world, not to leave the world. We're not, Judaism is not in general into a hermit's existence, or an existence of a life of celibacy, and so on and so forth. One is supposed to live in the world, but live properly in the world, and that is the idea. And so these 10 balance each other. The 10 utterances of the Torah balance the 10 utterances of creation, and it's our job to bring them into balance. And not only to bring them into balance, but as Yael was asking, in one of her questions, she said, is one enclosed within the other? That's the way it's supposed to be. The 10 utterances within the 10 utterances of creation are supposed to be the 10 commandments of the Torah. In other words, each one of the commandments is supposed to be the inner dimension of the of that aspect of creation. Yes, that is correct. And of course, related to the Sfirot as well. The Sfirot are the reservoirs which are connected by the 22 paths between the Sfirot, represented by 22 letters. Those are called also netivot, or channels, or pipes between the Sfirot. Okay. What else do I need to tell you here? Let me just see, 1 minute. Okay. Now, why there's specifically 32 paths? Why specifically 32? And the answer is, according to the Arizal, is that there are two very critical names, divine names, in the Torah. One is the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, Havaya, or as we pronounce it, Aleph Dalet, we pronounce it. We don't pronounce the name as it is. We're not allowed to do that except in the temple. But and then there is the so that Yud Hey Vav Hey, or Havaya as we say it, is the illumination, the divine light within the Sphira of Tiferet, essentially. And then there is the divine light that is in the Sphira of Malchut. It's called Aleph Dalet Nun Yud Adnai. All right, so that is 4 and 4. They each have 4 letters. So those two, Havaya and Adnai, have each 4 letters, together 8 letters, and the Arizal says that they are divided into 4 manifestations, essentially. So 8 times 4 is 32, and that's how you get the 32 paths. Thank you, thank you, Martin. If people can't read the comment, maybe a very famous Rabbi Moshe Miller wrote a great paper on the 10 utterances, which you can find in KabbalahOnline.org or in ChabadOnline.org. Yeah, ChabadOnline.org, or in Kabbalah with an H, KabbalahOnline.org. On the 10 utterances. Yes, that's true. I'm not sure it's very famous, but anyway. Okay, thank you for pointing that out, Martin. Yeah. Good. All right. So, so the result says that there's 32 paths because it has to do with the amalgamation, essentially how shall I say it, the yichud of those two names. Now, let me just explain a certain concept. Very, very, very important concept. One of the things that you will see throughout Kabbalistic writings, and you have to be very careful of not to not misunderstand it. One of the concepts that you'll see is a lot of anthropomorphisms. In fact, you get anthropomorphisms in the Torah itself. God spoke. He heard the sound of God walking in the Garden of Eden, so to speak, right? All of these are simply anthropomorphic expressions, in other words, human expressions for things that are of divine origin and have nothing to do with the physical body whatsoever. In other words, these anthropomorphisms are only there in order to be able to give us the ability to understand something. As there is a verse which says, from my own flesh I see God. In other words, if I look at my human flesh, I can use that as an analogy to understand godliness. So when I'm talking about the concept of giving, that would be represented by the right hand. If I'm talking about the concept of lifting up, that would be represented by the concept of the left hand, as you find in the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. Smolo tachat leroshi, his left hand is under my head, and as the commentators say, to lift up my head. V'yemino techabkeni, and his right arm embraces me. Now that what that looks like, quite simply, is an image of two lovers, right? His left hand is under my head, lifting up my head, and his right arm is embracing me, and that's exactly the wrong interpretation. Even though that's the interpretation that's given because there's no other choice, but the idea behind it is not the physicalized comparison of it. In other words, the physical component of it with two lovers together is the lowest form that you could possibly find it. But from that, we can understand the very highest form and how it is completely, the word in Hebrew is mufshat, it's completely stripped away from any physical connotation. We're talking about a concept of yichud. Yichud means the amalgamation of two divine concepts, in this case, two divine names, to create or to bring about a third reality. So there's two realities that combine to bring about a third reality, which is often higher than the first two. When two forces combine, it's not only the sum of their forces, but there's an additional force that comes about as a result of that combination, which is higher than both of them. In other words, they elicit a higher force into them. Okay, so I should have brought some water downstairs. Okay. All right. So what we are saying is that there were these two names, and these two names combine, and they combine in various ways. There's various permutations of the divine name. All of those two names, Havai and Adonai, and the permutations altogether are essentially 32. Right? There's 32 possible permutations of those names. I don't want to go into it any further, but that is the origin, according to the Arizal, of the 32 paths. Now, he does say that Hasidic discourses explain that these 32 paths do shine, they do illuminate the soul. But for most of us, since they're called pliyot chokhmah, wondrous paths, or paths beyond normal consciousness, therefore, it takes a lot of meditation and a lot of study to be able to recognize them, to be able to see them in operation, to experience them in operation. They operate very unconsciously, or superconsciously rather. They operate superconsciously, but they can be brought into consciousness if we know what it is that we are doing, at least to a certain extent. For very great souls, maybe to a great extent, but for people of a lower level of consciousness, then it would be only to the level which they are able to master the strength, so to speak. And that's exactly, in fact, why they're called netivot. And netiv means a narrow path. It doesn't mean a broad road, right? They're narrow paths. But nevertheless, they are present. They are present in the soul all the time. Some commentaries explain that it's only one of the paths, the highest of the paths, that never comes into consciousness or remains transcendent all the time, but all the others can come into consciousness with the right practice and the right meditation and the right study and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, there is there's a story, or a verse rather, about Jacob. When Jacob took those sticks, when he was doing, this is a verse in Genesis in chapter 30. You have a look at the whole chapter 30 over there, but it's chapter 30, verse 37. So he says over there, the Torah there is talking about when Jacob is taking the flocks, he's watching the flocks of his father-in-law Laban, and Laban starts to give him some of his own flocks, and then he takes them and he starts to do various Kabbalistic things to multiply. Yeah, let me just I'll do that in a second, Paula. He uses various things to multiply the effect of what it is that he's doing. And one of the things that it says there is he takes these certain poplar sticks, moist sticks, in other words, not dried out, but moist sticks, and he peels them and so on. But they're called makel livneh. Makel livneh, from a poplar, from the poplar tree. But the Zohar explains that the word livneh stands for, is a notarikon. In other words, each letter stands for a word. Lamed bet netivot hachochma, the 32 paths of divine wisdom. That is actually brought in Keter Shem Tov, one of the teachings of Baal Shem Tov, that the word livneh stands for Lamed Bet Netivot HaChochmah, the 32 paths of divine wisdom. And so Jacob, what he was doing was he was drawing down, using Kabbalistic means essentially, he was drawing them down towards himself so that he would be able to use them to, first of all, protect his family, because Laban was a rather wily and dishonest person, and also protect them and cause them to become much more godly themselves. That's what he was doing. He was revealing godliness through them in the world. Okay, so here, let me just I'll write it's spelled like this. I'm going to write it in caps, and I'm going to put dashes between them because you're not really allowed to write and erase the name. And that would be, no, I'm sorry. Let me just, another letter there. Yeah, that's how it would be spelled, right? Or in Hebrew, it would be like this. That's what it would be in Hebrew. Okay, the dash is between them, so I'm not actually writing the name. That represents Malchut, from the word Adon, which means master. Okay, so therefore, therefore, it says later on with Jacob when he prays, he says, "Kel Elokei Yisrael," God, the God of Jacob, and he uses the name Aleph Lamed. Aleph Lamed is really 31, not 32, because the 32nd path is not revealed. Only 31 of the paths becomes revealed. Therefore, he uses the name Kel Aleph Lamed, which is the paths that can be revealed. And it says that the 32nd path that cannot be revealed is actually the inner dimension of Keter, called Atik Yomin. There's a question here, which I'm not sure I can answer standing on one foot, so to speak. Explain the relationship between Jacob's dream and the paths going up and down, or the ones that were coming down related to the 32 paths of divine wisdom, and the paths going up, that they relate to the lower level paths coming from creation. No, actually the paths like this, the paths of creation come from above to below. God is the creator. They come from above to below, and therefore the channels get narrower and narrower and narrower as they go down through the worlds. The channels get constricted the further down they go. Each of the world actually has 32 channels. Each world, there's 4 manifested worlds. They have 32 channels there, and those are the paths of creation coming down and down and down and down and down, more and more and more and more constricted, with the light that becomes more and more and more hidden and constricted until we get to this physical world. Then there's the 32 paths returning up and up and up, but these are spiritual paths. They're not paths of creation. They're paths of enlightenment, essentially. They're paths, 32 paths of enlightenment. In other words, 32 paths to get to the highest level of each world, and then, in other words, the highest sphera in each world, and then to transcend that world into the next world. From the world, the consciousness of the world of Asiyah, to the consciousness of the world of Yetzira, and then to the consciousness of the world of Bria, and then to the consciousness of the world of Atzilut, and eventually beyond Atzilut to the consciousness of Adam Kadmon, and even beyond that, the consciousness of transcending the Tzimtzum, before the Tzimtzum, ultimate godly consciousness, God consciousness, which is obviously on an extremely high level. Okay, we didn't get all that far. We got some of the way, but we didn't get all of the way, that's for sure. So I think we're going to stop here, and we'll pick up next week with the rest of this Mishnah. I don't know if I'll finish it next week either. Probably we'll do a good chunk, but nevertheless. Yael, as far as the dreams are concerned, I don't recall having seen the 32 paths being associated with Jacob's dreams, but I could look into it more. I don't recall such a thing. Okay, any other questions? Okay, reach out privately for sure. All right, everybody. We will continue next week. There is a class again tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, I'm going to be talking, as per request, I'm going to be talking about the male and female aspects of divine manifestation called the Sfirot, the male and female aspects of the Sfirot. And again, don't take that literally. Yes, it's better to go slow than to go too fast and not be able to absorb anything. I mean, we have time, you know. Hopefully, I'll be around till 120, and then I don't think it'll take us that long to finish it, but you never know. All right. Anyone who wants a copy of the book, please reach out to me. Send me an email to Kabbalah decoded@gmail.com. Here, let me just write it for you. @gmail.com. I think that's right. Yeah, Kabbalah decoded@gmail.com. Not .co, but .com. Don't forget the M over there. And I should stop recording here.